Hello, my name is Sterling Krout, and believe it or not, I lived in this little village for 12 years only. I thought I lived here a long time, but I only lived for 12 years in this village. But tonight I would like to talk about those 12 years which were so good to me. I can't believe there is any better place to spend 12 years of your youth than in Amicsville. It was just wonderful. So tonight I'd like to call what I'm saying the good old days. Do you remember the good old days? I like to think I do, and I want you to help me. If I say something that you have a comment on, I would really like you to comment on it, because those 12 years were just wonderful. But I'll start at the beginning, and I thank you for the opportunity to talk about something that was very special in my life, being a part of this very small town. Now, the Krout family moved from Abbottstown to Manchester to Amicsville in 1942. My mother was Purdon, and my father was Albert. And there were 5 children: Geraldine, who's here this evening, Brother Wayne, and Brother Ken, and myself, and Brother Gary. It was very, very nice coming to Amicsville, because in 1942, Dad went to an auction to buy a house on Main Street. And I was with him that day. It was a 2-story house. It had 4 bedrooms, and it had a bath and running water. And Dad had $2,500 in his pocket. $2,500. Well, the bidding didn't last longer than, what I remember, longer than 10 minutes. And Dad was off the bidding already. But there was a man standing right next to Dad, and he whispered to him, and to this day I have no idea who that man was. But he said, "Albert, if you want the house, I will give you the money for the rest of the house above the $2,500. Well, the house went for $4,000, and Dad bought the house. At that point, I was just so excited that I remember I was excited because now we were going into a house where we had our own bedroom, we would have running water, we would have a bathtub, and in Manchester we did not have any of those things. And inside plumbing. 1942, there was a lot of outdoor plumbing still available. But we were really happy, and at least I was. And then I heard a comment from the back of the crowd, and the man said, "That man must be crazy for paying $4,000 for a house." But I was just so glad to be a part of Amicsville at that point. We moved into the house, and it was next to Beulah and Bill Dittenhafer, a family of 2 that certainly didn't need a family of 7 right next to them. But we tried to stay off of Beulah's lawn and Bill's lawn, but we became really good friends to that family. And like I said, I remember back that now we're coming from Manchester to Amicsville in what I called a sheep truck and a Model T Ford. And we moved into this house. We had a few wooden beds and mattresses and a few chests of drawers, a breakfast set with 6 odd chairs, and a washing machine, a refrigerator, and kitchen accessories. And like you all know, hand-me-downs from whoever gave them to you. And that's what we moved to Amicsville with, but that was okay with me. These were the good old days, and there were no jeans, no sneakers, or no sunglasses. This was just the necessary things that we had when we came to Amicsville. But Geraldine went on to high school. Brother Wayne worked for my dad as a mechanic in the middle of town. Ken was my mentor and the historian in the family. He's the one I looked up to all the time, and he loved story night. God bless him, he'd be here today. He would love to hear what I was about to say, and of course Brother Gare came on the end, but it was good. And now I get to the point where I start to wonder about why I'm here tonight because of just 12 years. Gary and I, were 10 and 13 years old at the time, a few years after we arrived, and we became the newspaper boys. So now you are down to the newspaper boys giving you what we saw Amingsville, how we saw Amingsville. And I never thought of it at the time, but I would have been 13, Gary would have been 10, and we were out of bed at 5 o'clock in the morning to bring the newspapers to everyone in Amingsville. And no fear of walking the streets at 5. Gary will tell you a few that he thought he had. I didn't even think of fear at that time, but nevertheless, it was dark. It was 5 o'clock in the morning. No streetlights, no sidewalks, no cars. Actually, the road was 22 feet across. 22 feet, the road from North York to Amingsville, 22 feet. Not much for cars to pass. But nevertheless, early in the morning, 6 days a week, we would wait for the truck to bring the papers from York that were delivered in Amingsville, Manchester, Mount Wolf, and I guess York Haven. But it was a precious cargo. It could not get wet. There were 90 newspapers Brother Gary and I had to deliver every morning. And we were happy to do that. But I started thinking, when they asked me to do this, I thought, I wasn't aware that we were bringing the news of the world to Amingsville, because everybody relied on the newspaper. And the guys that were going to work in York, they wanted their newspaper early, and they wanted to read it before they went to work. And the newspaper was, to Brother Gary and I, were special, because the newspaper went between the screen door and the regular door. And the first thing that you learned was that you did not slam the screen door at 5 o'clock in the morning. If you did, you can bet somebody would tell Dad, and Dad would be right back to you. So, and the newspapers, the newspapers were used for everything. And I won't stay on this too long, but the newspapers, sometimes you shared them with the person next door. I asked Gary if he knew how much the newspaper was in 1942. I don't remember, 43, 45. Does anybody remember? Nobody can help me with the price of the newspaper? I should remember, but I don't. What was that?
Wasn't it 5 cents?
It could have been, easily. I mean, not more than that, 5 cents for the newspaper. But I started to think about it, then the newspaper was used for everything. Geraldine will tell me, I'm sure, that Mom lined the cupboards with newspaper for the dishes and the glasses. The newspapers were put in your peach basket to put the things up in the attic. The papers were used. I remember one thing. Mom used the newspapers in the pantry, because when she had the canned items and the peaches and the vegetables, and you would put them on the newspaper with that date on it. And then those were the ones that you would use first, the oldest date. So Mom, and the ones that you ladies should find amusing is that Mom would wash up the linoleum floor, and then she would put newspaper on the floor after it was washed. Did anybody else do that? Newspaper on the floor. And I never thought about it, but it was just a ritual that everybody did. It kept the floor clean, for a day or two longer, and then you would pick it up and so on. But the newspaper, so I'll get off the newspaper. We were on that long enough, I guess. But let's talk about the properties and the people of Amingsville. That's what I really wanted to talk about. If you could just visualize for a moment coming from North York to Amingsville and not seeing a building. It was nothing but farmland the whole way to Amingsville in 1942. Very few buildings of buildings of any kind. Except I remember Mr. Kindig, the house in the middle of the hill. That seemed to be the first one, but it might not have been, but it was, the house on the right was the Kindig property. And from there, at the bottom of the hill, there was a large white barn, and there is where the fire company is built today on that. They bought that barn, the fire company bought that from Lupels and built the fire company there. Going into, of course, there's the large white farm building on the left, and our house was right next to that farm building. And then I got to thinking we were a little town of poor people. I don't know if you thought of yourself poor, but I thought of us as poor, not to the point that we didn't have enough to eat, but just we didn't have money for a lot of extra things. But we were surrounded by the Bakers, the Dashews, the Amigs, the Appels, and we lived in the town on the various streets. But nevertheless, the rest of us were considered middle class. And then I remembered one person that I wanted to start with as people, and that was Herman Stebbins. Did anybody remember Herman Stebbins? Herman would bring you, thank you, Herman would bring you the farm news. Every morning he'd bring you the farm. Hello, this is Herman Stebbins bringing you the farm news, so-and-so. He would tell you when to plant, when to harvest, the price of eggs, just everything. But every morning, that was the first thing I would hear. And then I remembered a man by the name of Sam Leitner. Did anybody remember Sam Leitner? Okay. Sam, when I was here as a child, I remembered if you did anything wrong, you had to answer to Sam Leitner. Is that the truth? Sam Leitner would go to your father, and then you would be scolded because of what you did. So was he the constable? Is that right, Mr. Kindy? He was the constable. I'm sure at that time I didn't even know what a constable was, but I knew Sam Leitner and a fair man. I always liked Sam Leitner, and of course, when he passed me, I said, "Hello, Mr. Leitner," that sort of thing. But and then there was the man. Well, I went a little fast there. It went from Sam Leitner to your father to Elmer Fink, because Elmer Fink was the Justice of the Peace at the time, and he too was a fair man, a man that whenever you'd see the state police car in front of his house, you would know that something was going on in Amigsville at that time, or Manchester Township. But then I thought of Ellis Wombaugh, and I consider him the financial man in Amigsville. He seemed to know more about finances. And today the house that he built in the middle of Amigsville is like a state-of-the-art house. And how the man was that knowledgeable enough to know to build a house like that in the middle of Amigsville, and today it still looks the same. And my friend will know. and then there was a man by the name of Doggy Brule. I didn't know Doggy Brule, but I know that he knew everything about everything, and I hope I'm right on that. Doggy was a nice man and got involved in everything, but what a great guy. And now help me out. Was Mr. Schrahl in charge of the train station, and Mr. Charleston was in charge of the post office? Does anybody help me out on that? Nobody? Mr. Schrahl, what did they know? Do you know what he did by any chance, Harlan? Oh, okay, but there were two of the other men that and then the father figured. Okay, go ahead. Okay.
Schrahl lived on Main Street.
Yes.
From,
yes, from the church.
Yes.
And where was he employed?
Mr. Schrahl?
Yes.
He was at the railroad station.
He was a railroad station. He would have been the guy who put the mailbag on the train by the big hook every morning, and that's how the mail got to town, and vice versa when it came back, I guess. Okay. And Mr. Charleston.
Lived at the corner of
yes. And what did Mr. Charleston do?
He was at the post office.
Oh, he was a post office, so I did kind of have them right. And then, of course, I went on to think about the father figures in Emmetsville. Mr. Ruby, Herb Harry, Mr. Bixler, Mr. Schaefer, the electrician, and Mr. Dessenberg, the man that I consider the music man of Emmetsville. I mean, and of course, the man that I admired, I think, the most was Bill Elliker, who was a member of this church and is still living, and a very nice man in the community. He would do just about what had to be done to make things right. And I always liked Mr. Elliker. But, and of course, he gave me my first job. I guess that's why I liked him. But then I stopped, and I said, enough about the men. The driving force in this community were the women. And I stand here and will believe it till I'm going. The ladies of the fire company auxiliary and the band auxiliary were the driving force of this town. And I can still hear Mom say, would you believe the fire company wants some money from the auxiliary for another fire engine? What do we need with another fire engine? But they did. The ladies made the money in this town, and they gave it back to the town without asking for anything in return. They were by far, and I think sometimes now the Taj Mahal fire station up in Round Town is now called the Alert Fire Company 1. And why they chose Emmetsville as that fire company to take up there, I don't know the answer to that. But I know the plaque in that fire company should say, dedicated to the women of Emmetsville, because they contributed so much to that fire company. And I might be wrong, but that's just how I felt about it. Okay, then I'm going to go on a little bit to talk about the happenings in Emmetsville. And to me, this is one of the happenings that I did not like. I did not like going to school in Emmetsville. I did not like Charlie Drawball. Charlie Drawball did not like the male gender. I don't think there was ever a female person that got spanked by Charlie Drawball. But I don't think there was a male gender that wasn't spanked by Charlie Drawball. Charlie Drawball he taught by what we used to call the tune of the hickory stick. He had a large hickory stick right behind him on a map. And he had a thing about it. You would be sitting in class, and all of a sudden he reached back, and when he reached back, he got the stick. And somebody was going to get it that day. And nobody knew who it was. And then the next day he would reach back, and he'd pull the map down. And I'm thinking, you know what? But Charlie, he taught that way, and in today's society, he couldn't get by doing that. He couldn't teach that way today. And therefore, he made it very difficult for me to go to grade school. And he had a thing about whenever he wanted to punish you, he would make you go into the bathroom and get a paper towel. And at that time, the desks had that little flap on the front of the desk that came down. You could sit in front of your desk also. Well, you had to get the piece of paper, and you had to put your foot up on. Now, there I was doing something you couldn't do. You could not rest your elbow on your knee. You had to stand like that till your knee or until your leg began to tingle. And then you would say, Mr. Drawball, may I change legs? And he'd say no. So you would stand for another 10 minutes. And then you would lean on it. And he'd say, Sterling, get your elbow off your knee. Okay, so you got your elbow off your knee, because if you didn't, you were going to get spanked. 10 minutes later, you'd say, Mr. Drawba, may I change legs? And he'd say, yes. So you'd put this leg up. So, and then school was taught, then, now I can realize maybe that Mr. Drawball had a reason to be like that. He might have had 4 classes in one room. And while he was teaching the 8th grade, the 7th grade had to be quiet, the 6th grade had to be quiet, and so on down the line. And then he would teach the next class, and then that group had to be quiet or study. But, so he had a tough job, but he didn't have to take it out on the males. I mean, that's just the way it was. And then, of course, I want to stop on Charlie Drawbaugh by saying, weren't we all happy when we took the 8th grade exam? I mean, you were so afraid you were not going to pass the 8th grade exam so that you could go on to North York High School. And you kind of buckled down, studied a little bit more that year so that you would pass the 8th grade exam. But a few years passed, and I want to just bring into mind a few things that I remember when I was here. Like, I remember in 1945, on April the 12th, 1945, President Roosevelt died. And of course, Roosevelt had polio since 1921. So, but the war was near the end, and Mr. Roosevelt, President Roosevelt, was going to, well, first of all, he was in Hot Springs some Springs, Georgia. He was there when he died of a brain hemorrhage, and they brought him from there to Washington, and he laid in state in Washington. And I want you to tell me whether I'm right or wrong. Did the funeral train come through Amicsville about 2 weeks later with a flag-draped caboose? Did anybody see that? Why me? Why me? Somebody had to see that train. It was on its way from Washington to Hyde Park, New York for burial. Nobody, come on. I'm beginning to think I made up the story. But the train came through Amicsville in the middle of the afternoon with a flag-draped caboose. Nobody. Where were you all?
Sterling?
Yes.
I live right along the railroad, and I can attest to that fact.
Oh, thank you very much. I thought it was one of those senior moments, and I didn't want to start getting those yet.
I thought Mr. Dromall was a great teacher because I never had to do that. You must have been bad.
We all know he was the best.
Well, thank you very much. That's great. And then I'll go on a little bit farther. I remembered living in Amicsville, and in 1952, the viral infection of polio, infantile paralysis, and I think it made all of us afraid at that time. The dreaded disease of polio, you know, but it was nice. It didn't hit our community. Maybe somebody remembers someone that had it. But it didn't hit Amicsville. But in 1952, there were about 60,000 cases of polio, and I know how we dreaded that time. But move on a little bit, and I wanted to tell you a little bit about what we did in Amicsville back then. We watched TV, of course, at Schaefer's store, and it was so snowy. Most of the time, you couldn't tell what you were watching, but nevertheless, it was fun to have television, and Mr. Schaefer was good enough to let us come up. Does anybody remember the programs from maybe 1953? I remember the one, and I'm going to do this for you. I told myself maybe I wouldn't, but I'm going to tell you this. Does anyone remember the Firestone Hour? Okay, the Firestone Hour, I fell in love with the Firestone Hour. It went like this. If I could tell you of my devotion, if I could sing of my love for you, then my confession would find direction for all the music my heart beats for you. I loved it. Thank you. Thank you for allowing me to do that. But then on Sunday nights, and I'm going to quote again, it was Mr. District Attorney. Did anybody listen to Mr. District Attorney? Mr. District Attorney, champion of the people, defender of truth, guardian of our fundamental rights to life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness. And every Sunday night, I listened to Mr. District Attorney. But those are the fun things that I remembered about Amicsville, and I could sing a few more for you, but I'm not going to. The Pepsi jingle and so on, but whatever, on the radio. But it was fun. Gary and I got to talking the other day. There were 2 covered bridges in outside of Amicsville. The one I remember was the one that crossed the Codorus Creek right where the Christ Field is now. There was a flour mill there, right? Okay, I don't know the name of it, the flour mill, but Gary tells me there was one down at Mundus Mills also. Does anyone remember? Don't remember this one, okay? Because Gary said it was there. He said that the cement bridge at Mundus Mills was one time a cover bridge. Was that true? It washed away. Oh, way to go, Gary. Way to go, Gary. And of course, I'll keep moving on. I got to get finished here, but I love this. And I loved Amicsville, and I loved my mother because every Easter she would buy me a new Easter outfit. Do you remember how we got Easter outfits every Easter, regardless of whether you needed it or not? You were going to church that day with a new Easter outfit. Coming here, sitting up here and singing, it brought back memories because I remember when this was changed over from the regular church to the new look. And tonight when I walked into it, I thought how beautiful it still looks after all those years that I've been away. You know, this was just a fine little church. But then on to high school, and of course, it was so much fun thinking about Friday nights when we could go to Smalls Athletic Field and watch York High play football. They were just delightful evenings on Friday nights. But I wanted to just bring out one thing. In 1953, York High did not have any girls' sports. And I know that doesn't go with what I'm talking about tonight, but no girls' sports in 1953 at York High. It was just unreal. And they had basketball, and you girls might remember, but you could only play half of the court of the basketball. You didn't play full court. They had 3 defensive players and 3 offensive players. And the girls on defense could only take 2 steps, and then they had to give it to the offensive player. Does anybody remember girls basketball? It still blows my mind to think that they did that back in 1953, you know. And but that's why I wanted to just bring up that little note about. Would you believe at that point in 1953 I got my draft notice? So then I was leaving Amicsville, and I was leaving Amicsville forever, and it was kind of sad that I spent my whole life here, and then 12 years actually, and now you're in the Army, but whatever. But I put a little page in here tonight, and I said, how did we survive? We had very little medicine. We had aspirin, maybe liniment, cough syrup, Vicks, and Pepto-Bismol. And we bought it from the Raleigh man truck. The Raleigh man truck, or the Fulton Brush truck. I mean, those were the days. I just had a washing machine with ringers. Don't put your hand in the river. Guess who put their hand in the river? And Mom had to back you out. But Mom, God love her, she would let me put the bluing in the wash water. The rinse water, I shouldn't say the wash water. The rinse water. Do you remember when we used that? But it was just something I wanted to say. And I'm going to close with this little story about my father. And I thought of all the good things that happened in this town, there had to be something bad. There had to be something in this little town that was bad. Now, whether this was bad or not, I don't know. But it started out with my father, in his later years, was very hard to pull anything out of him as to what happened in Amingsville. So I couldn't question him because, frankly, my dad didn't like me. I was the third son, and he thought I was one of those little smart guys. And whenever he'd say, "You're smart, aren't you?" and I said, "Yes, I am, Dad." And that would make him a little angrier. But nevertheless, Dad was so proud of being part of a group that met at the Grange building. Possibly 50 men. And I have no knowledge of that. I don't know how many there might have been, but I think Dad quoted 50 at one time. These men met and had a plan to pay $1 per month toward burial. Now, the burial was for male only. And it was mind-boggling to me because I wondered what happened to the females. Who buried them? Who paid for that? But this was money that was set aside, and it was set aside in an irrevocable trust, meaning it went into the bank and you could not touch it. The money was put in there, and the only time you could get the money out of there is if you died. If the male died, you could get the money. In 2005, I'll move on a little bit. In 2005, in the M&T Bank in Buffalo, there was $45,000 in that account. And there were still 10 men left on that list. You could get buried, and the number of people that were still living would be divided into that number, and that would be the amount of money that you would get for burial. It wasn't full cost burial, but it was burial money. Dad took great delight in telling me that he gave my mother a great burial. He didn't pay a nickel. Mom paid her own burial. But Dad would say, there's still money there left to bury me. I said, okay. It's kind of selfish as far as I was concerned, but so I went along with Dad. At that point, I was handling Dad's affairs, and he was 97 years old. 97 years old, and he didn't want to do anything that I asked him to do, like pay bills or pay insurance, pay medical care. He didn't want to hear any of that. He was old enough he didn't have to pay it anymore. But anyway, one evening, now here's where I get to my story. One evening, a man called me on the phone, and he said, "Sterling, I understand you're handling my father's estate." And I thought, Dad doesn't have an estate. Yes, I'm paying the bills if that's the case. But nevertheless, he said to me, your father was a member of the Grange. And I said, yes. And he said, they had a big long table at the Grange. And when you were getting into the Grange, they would do an initiation on you. And they would blindfold you. But they'd let you see enough of the table to see the pot in the middle of the table that had red hot coals in it, and it had a sword sticking in it. And the sword, we know now, was painted on the end with red paint on the end of the sword. Okay? This man said to me, do you know, he he said to me, "Do you know where the robes are?" And me in my smart aleck way, I said, "No, but I know where the hoods are." And his man said to me, "You do?" And I got to thinking then, oh gosh, don't tell me that the Grange people were those kind of people, and my dad was part of it. I didn't want that to be, but nevertheless, this man told me, and he was still a member of this Grange that was still going to get some of this money. He wanted to know whether my father was still living. And I said, "Yeah, Dad's living. He's at the county home. He is now 97 years old." But this man was thinking that whatever amount of money was going to be in this account, it was going to be divided by the last couple of guys that was there, or whether you would outlive everybody else and you'd be the last person to get the money. It didn't work that way. This was an irrevocable trust. And when everybody dies and there's still money there, it will go back to the bank. This is where the men must have made a mistake. They should have made it a revocable one. And the last 5 guys could have shared the money, you know? But it didn't work that way. But my dad passed on then. April 6, 2008. He was 100 years old, 1 month and 20 days. Dad was cremated, and the fund paid for his funeral. So Dad was correct. There was money there to bury him, but it would have been $4,500, and of course the cremation didn't cost that much. But I wonder where these men were coming from when they were thinking about paying their own funerals, but not the women. And I guess I'll just have to live with that, you know? But I'll close, and I did talk for a long time. I'm sorry. My quaint little town is still here, but Route 83 and Interstate 83 and the industrial park hasn't made it what it was back then in the good old days. But in closing, I say I was a very fortunate person to have lived in Amingsville with such good people. And I cannot think of a finer place to spend my early childhood. And thank you very much.